Hi, I'm John Leonard. I'm a corporate lawyer with Fairfield and Woods in Denver, Colorado. We're joined here today with one of my partners, Ryan Tharp. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Let's have a conversation about which entity somebody would want to pick or a founder would want to pick when starting a business. So let's start with a question that we see a lot. People want to know if they should have a corporation, and if so, a C or an S corporation, or whether they should be a limited liability company. What are some of the things that you talk with clients about to counsel them on that?
Yeah, I think I generally start with the premise of their right to select an entity, because one of the things that having an entity does is provides limited liability, which means that the company's debts don't become and obligations don't become the personal obligations of the founders and other shareholders or owners. So it's totally appropriate to use an entity. And then the question is, which is the right one? I usually start with the question of what's the business and where's the business going to go? And that really starts with the question of what kind of capitalization and funding is the business going to need to achieve its goals? If the business is going to be taking on money if the company is going to be taking on money from kind of traditional venture capital investments that are usually, funds and that sort of thing, usually a C corporation is the right way to go for a variety of tax and kind of historical reasons.
And probably a Delaware corporation, taxed as a C corporation.
Very often a Delaware corporation. One of the nice things about Colorado is that it's very easy to change from a Colorado corporation to a Delaware corporation if that needs to happen. But Delaware is yes, the standard kind of choice for which state to incorporate in. And if the company's going to need capital and need investment, but it's not necessarily coming or not sure it's going to be coming from those traditional kind of VC funds, an LLC is also a really good option because anybody can invest in an LLC, and we'll talk about the tax aspects of that here in a second, but that can be a really good option that offers a lot of flexibility and some clear advantages of C corporations.
Well, let's talk about the tax aspects. Is there a difference between a C corporation and an S corporation regarding taxes?
There is. So an S corporation is taxed as a flow-through entity or a pass-through entity, which means the corporation itself, subject to some kind of nuanced, differences, doesn't pay taxes itself. But a C corporation does pay taxes on its earnings. So that's a big difference. Oftentimes you'll hear of C corporations in terms of double taxation. And people want to avoid that because when you do the analysis, it's a real thing, and it really does increase the taxes. And not to mention, corporate tax rates could go up, which could make that even worse. And C corporations are hard too, because once you're a C corporation, it's very hard to get out of being a C corporation. So while it's a perfectly legitimate option, it's something that we want to be careful before rushing into being a C corporation. S corporations are hard because, not hard, but they're not appropriate if you necessarily want to bring on investment, because they have some restrictions on what kind of equity the investors can receive. And oftentimes investors don't want to invest in an S corporation for those reasons. There's some other restrictions as well, but so S corporations are great if you're running a landscaping business or something like that, or a construction company. But if you're a tech startup that's going to need money, S corporations really aren't the best option.
Yeah. Well, how about LLCs? When should you use that, and how are they taxed?
Yeah, LLCs are a really great option. They're very flexible. You can go from being an LLC to a C corporation very easily, whereas you can't go from a C corporation to an LLC very easily. So LLCs are great in that respect. They're taxed as partnerships by default, although you can vary that. And being a partnership means it's also a flow-through entity, kind of like an S corporation. And that means that the partner or the LLC itself does not pay taxes on its income. That's really beneficial because you don't have that double layer of tax. The downside to an LLC is because it has that flexibility and that partnership taxation, some of the things you might want to do can become more complicated, like equity incentives and things like that.
Yeah.
They're just they just take a little more work to set up than a C corporation.
Yeah. Well, I know when we set up companies, we're anxious to give good advice on agreements between the founders and between the founders and company. Just generally, if we're setting up a corporation, what documents does a corporation have, and which documents should founder shareholders have between themselves or with the company?
Yeah, I mean, most basically, a corporation needs articles and bylaws. That's what every corporation needs at a minimum. And then another document that you often see is a document called the shareholders agreement. Sometimes it's called a founders agreement, that basically sets the expectation of what happens in the business if somebody leaves, just kind of running through some of the common things that could happen. And then there's some agreements that need to be in one of those documents. They can be in the bylaws sometimes or in the shareholder agreement. So that's like restrictions on transfer. If you start a business with your founder, with your partner, you may not want the other founder to sell his interest to a completely unrelated third party because you didn't sign up necessarily to do business with that unrelated third party. And you also want to be careful, and your other founders want to be careful, that if somebody leaves and decides that they're going to just not be involved in, they're going to move up to the mountains and be a ski bum and not be involved in the business anymore, that 5 years down the road, they're not a significant owner of the business, but put in no sweat in making the business profitable. So you need a way to get them out if they decide that they're not going to be part of the business anymore.
Well, how do those agreements find their way into an LLC operating agreement? Are they separate agreements, or are they within the operating agreement?
So yeah, an LLC, unlike a corporation, has articles of organization which get filed with the state. But then, rather than having bylaws and a shareholder agreement, they have one document called an operating agreement that lists all the governance stuff, how everything makes decisions, and all of those same fundamental agreements in terms of what happens if someone dies, what happens if someone leaves, you can't sell to third parties, that sort of stuff all lives in the operating agreement. So it needs to live somewhere.
Great advice. I know your contact information will be after this slide. Thanks for joining us today, Ryan.
Thank you.